Thank you very much for joining us. This is all about why microlearning is the most powerful tool in your learning content strategy. I'm Emma Layton, the Chief Content Officer at Thrive. I oversee the content team who work on our off-the-shelf catalogue. I'm joined by my colleague Megan, who is the Head of Learning Design at Thrive, and Michael Brown, who is one of our valued clients. He's the Digital Learning Manager at Vanquis Bank. Megan's going to start us off by showing us a video that we produce here at Thrive, so I'll hand over to her to kick us off.
Thank you, Emma. I just want to get us started with a little video that we made here at Thrive. Okay, so what can we take away from that video? Well, first of all, it tells us that climate change is happening. It tells us that humans are the reason for it. It tells us that we need to do something about it, and indeed that we can do something about it. So that's quite a lot, really. And that animation was only actually 35 seconds long. It didn't use any words at all to address the learner until that sentence at the very end. So this just shows the power of microlearning. You don't need to spend a lot of time saying something to get your message across. You just need to say it in the right way. What is microlearning? Well, the official definition is that it's small learning units of content that are generally used to teach skills-based stuff. There's no official cutoff for exactly how long it can be to count as microlearning, but here at Thrive, we won't make anything that takes longer than 10 minutes for people to complete. And many of our learning resources are actually much shorter than that. They come in lots of different formats. So we have e-learning modules, but we also create videos, PDFs, infographics, and we do things like personality quizzes and songs. So basically, you name it, we've done it. So why is microlearning so powerful? Well, I won't spend too long on this, but just to sum up, first of all, it's quick. Studies have found that the average employee spends just 11 minutes working on something before they're interrupted by something else. So microlearning makes the most of the limited time that learners do have. Next, it's ready when you need it. So when things are in small chunks, it's much easier to find a specific bit of content when you need it. So this is what we call just-in-time learning, and it's something that microlearning does really well. Next, it grabs your attention. So it's a little bit controversial, this question of whether people's attention spans are getting shorter. But what we can say is that people certainly seem to be getting choosier about what they pay attention to. So obviously, microlearning has less demand for people to focus for extended periods of time. But also, like, thinking of this idea of choosiness, it leads into my final point, which is that microlearning forces us as content creators to be more concise and just more choosy ourselves about what we get across to learners. So this is definitely a good thing. We don't want to waste people's time, but it's also more difficult to do than we sometimes think. So this is a quote that I really like. It's by Mark Twain, who's a famous American writer. And he said, "I didn't have time to write a short letter, so I wrote a long one instead." And in a lot of ways, this actually sums up learning design for me. So it actually takes me a lot longer to create a 10-minute module on a topic than it does a 30-minute one on the same thing. And the reason for that is at Thrive, we don't just get content and write it up nicely. So we spend a lot of time really thinking about how we're going to make best use of the learner's time. So we're always like removing stuff, cutting things down, thinking of simpler ways to get content across, rewriting until we get it right. And it's not just our individual resources that we do all this work for. So we also think at the big picture level about how all our microlearning content is going to work together. For us, creating good microlearning is all about getting into this mindset of thinking about how to teach things effectively and then putting the time and effort into doing that.
Okay, so this is where a lot of organisations get it wrong because they don't see that hard work that goes into creating good microlearning. Perhaps they see microlearning as something that they can just tag onto an existing learning approach. So, for example, if you've already got a lot of resources in-house on a learning management system, perhaps you go to a microlearning provider and just tag their catalogue onto what you have already, but you're not going to get the best results out of that. In the context of something like mental health, what microlearning is not about is just culling all of the content you can find and then arbitrarily splitting it up into small chunks, because you haven't got that thought of the overall learner journey and how much time people are going to be spending on a subject area overall. It's also not about just kind of arbitrarily committing to saying, right, we won't produce any piece of content that's over X amount of minutes. That does have a place, but if you don't have a strategy and you're not thinking about content at the next level up in terms of, like I said, those overall learning journeys, then actually you're probably not reducing people's time overall, and you might just confuse them and overwhelm them. What it's about at Thrive is about having a big picture approach to content. It's about looking at mental health content in general and defining what you think good mental health content looks like, and then producing discrete units of content that align with that messaging, so that you can create really powerful, meaningful learner journeys out of that content that are personalized to your users. So really, let's go back to the title of this webinar. It's all about context. Microlearning is a powerful tool, but only in the context of your learning content strategy. So it's about you thinking what you want your learning to be, what good learning looks like, and just kind of understanding a bit about your learners and what their needs are before you can make anything, including microlearning, powerful. So we kind of have this little joke at Thrive that actually we're reclaiming the word microlearning, because unless it is this really overall focused, streamlined content from which you can formulate these really meaningful learner journeys, then actually it's not actually microlearning at all, because the total seat time for a learner is going to be just as long as it was before you had that particular approach in place. So what does this actually look like? Well, Megan's going to talk you through what our strategy looks like for when we create our off-the-shelf microlearning.
Okay, thank you, Emma. So thinking of our big picture content strategy, here's how we do it at Thrive. So first of all, we'll identify a content gap. So that's a term we use for any skill set or topic, like broad topic that we want to create learning on. So this might be something like communication or leadership, or for you, it could be something specific to your organisation. But for today, I'm going to use the example that Emma's already mentioned, which is mental health. So at Thrive, we decided to create a bunch of content on mental health. So where do we start? Well, we always start by identifying the big picture goal that we want to achieve. So this is the change that we want to see in the world as a result of the learning that we're creating. So for mental health, the overall goal was to create a more positive atmosphere around mental health. Now, this is a pretty soft goal, but for you, you might have something that's quite specific to your organisation. So like if you can make it measurable, then that's even better. For example, you might want to increase sales by a certain amount, or reduce the number of calls to a certain department. And, you know, if you can make it measurable, then that is really good, because it allows you to measure the success of your content more easily. So we've got our goal. What's the next thing we do? Well, the next thing we do is to identify the changes that we need to see in our learners in order to achieve that goal. What do we need to see happening differently within our organisation to get to where we want to be? So for mental health, we had a list of 6 changes, and these are just 3 of them. So at this point, we spent quite a long time thinking about what we want to achieve, the changes that we want to see in our learners. We'll use different approaches to understand our learners and what they need. And it's only at this point that we actually start thinking about the topics that we want to cover. So we come up now with a rough list of topics that we want to create microlearning resources on. And this is something that we think really hard about. It's important to us that there's minimal repetition across different microlearning resources. And we also want each resource to work completely standalone, so that it's discrete. You don't need to have looked at any other content in order for it to make sense to you. So for mental health, we actually had 13 resources in the end, and here are just 3 of the ones that we created. So for you, if you've got existing content within your organisation that you want to integrate with some new microlearning that you're creating, this is the point at which it'd probably be a good idea to think about what content you've got and whether it would fit into that list. And for us, this process isn't just a one-time thing, so we regularly return to our content plans and we tweak them to respond to the world around us, and that's something that we'd encourage other organisations to do as well. And you'll notice that our process means that our titles look very different to what you tend to see when it comes to e-learning. And the reason for that is that we start from the change that we want to see in the world, and we create resources that help to make that change. We don't start from the content and think of ways to get that information across, which is the way it typically seems to be done. And the outcome of that is that our resources tend to be more practical and more targeted, which is perfect for microlearning. But it's not just our titles that feel quite different to other stuff that's out there. I think our process and mindset makes our content itself look really, really different to other stuff that's out there. And I just want to show you an example from our catalogue. So this is our stigma and mental health resource from our mental health bundle. And I'm going to kick us off now. It kicks off with a little video, so I'll play that for you now. Oops.
Mental health. It's the elephant in the room. We've all got it, but it's hard to talk about.
Okay, so now you're asked a question. Where do you feel comfortable talking about your mental health? So is it with your partner? Is it at work? Is it with your friends? Or is it nowhere? So what this question is getting you to do is reflect on your own experience and assumptions when it comes to mental health. So it's encouraging us to be more conscious of our own state of mental health. And if you remember, that was one of the changes that we identified when we were planning out the content. We wanted to make people more aware of their own mental health. So when I submit my answer now, we're going to see another little video.
It's tricky, isn't it? There's a lot of misinformation out there. No wonder it's hard to talk about mental health. But when we don't speak up, we don't get the support we need.
Okay, so that video there was achieving a couple of things. So first of all, it was showing you what the stigma around mental health looks like. So if we think of the words in the speech bubbles that popped up, I'm sure that we can all recognise this kind of misinformation and bias when it comes to mental health. And what that means is that we haven't needed to spell out a definition of what stigma is exactly. We've just shown what it looks like and then relied on our learners to join the dots themselves. And that's one of the ways that we keep things really concise at Thrive. We let the learners have to put that work in rather than spoon feeding them every little bit of information. And that's got the additional benefit of, as well as taking less time, in our experience, people are just a lot more likely to remember stuff when they've had to put some effort into understanding the content. Another thing that our video did, and indeed this whole resource does, is to encourage those conversations around mental health. So remember, that was one of the changes that we identified when we were planning out the content, that we wanted to see people more open to having those mental health conversations. And stigma is one of the things that we identified was stopping those conversations. So just to finish up this resource, we then go on to see some really practical, actionable tips about things that we can do to help combat stigma when it comes to mental health. And you'll notice that these are really concise. So when we talk about how concise our content is, that's something that we really mean. So for us, everything has to be meaningful and add value, or it doesn't belong in microlearning, basically. And in my mind, that's why microlearning is so powerful. When it's done properly, it forces us as content creators to focus on the most important stuff, to be clever about how we teach it, and to really make the most of the learner's time.
Okay, thank you, Megan. So ultimately, you've seen, how this content looks, but microlearning, like any learning, is only powerful if people are actually using it. So at this point, I wanted to give a few high-level tips on how to get people to engage with your content, and particularly if you're taking catalogue and implementing it, integrating it with what you already have, then what some good ways to go about doing that are. So the first thing to think about is how to deliver learning within the stream of work. And this is about a few things, really. One of them is about catching on to what's going on in your business. So, for example, with that mental health content, if it's Mental Health Month, then pushing that content out to people within the context of that event so that they're already thinking about these things and it's in their consciousness and it's more relevant to them at that time. But also here, it's about utilising your platform. So, for example, our LXP has some really intelligent functionality around things like searchability, tagging content, but also linking content to each other. So what that means is it's really easy to find a piece of content, which, like Megan said, is also supported by the fact that it is in small units. But also, once you've found that content, if you then have the time as a learner to move on to something else, like encouraging them to do that as part of a natural journey. So giving them that visibility of content that is related to the item that they're already looking at. It's also about treating learning like marketing. So this is a bit of a mantra that we use for a lot of the webinars and events and things that we talk about in terms of our products, because marketing is about engaging customers and about getting people to buy into something. And likewise, that's what you're trying to do with your end users when you're talking about learning. So let's learn some lessons from marketing. We talked about that Mental Health Month and using that content then. That's essentially a campaign, right? You're just kind of using events throughout the year to dictate what you want to promote amongst your content at that time of year. But perhaps it's also about having little strategies in place or techniques. So, for example, one thing we do with our clients when we have a new release in our catalogue is to promote it using our new module Mondays. So we do a little teaser of what that content is and give our clients and any prospects an idea of like how that content could be used. And we've also found that some of our clients, like Deciem, have actually adopted that internally. So when we do have a new module Monday, this is something they then do on their own system to promote the content and get people familiar with what it is and why it's useful. And then the final thing you could do is just generally to get people excited about the learning. So this links to the things we've already talked about, but it's also more specifically about listening to your learners. So, getting information out of them about what they want to see and what they've enjoyed, using the data that's available on any platforms you have to figure out which modules or resources are being most used, which ones aren't. But also just about, seeking their opinions. So asking them what they'd like to see and figuring out a bit about them and what they enjoy learning. So these are all very high level things in terms of things that anyone can do to promote microlearning within their organisation. Michael is an existing client of ours, as I said at the beginning, and at Vanquis Bank, they've been using our catalogue for over a year now, and they've seen some really positive results. So he's going to talk to you a bit about how they integrated it and some of the ideas they've had for how to do that.
Cool, thanks Emma. So hello everybody. As Emma said, my name is Michael, and I'm the Digital Learning Manager at Vanquis, and we've been using Thrive, as Emma also said, for just over a year. In that time, I think there's 4 or 5 kind of key things that we've utilised in order to engage people with microlearning content and really get them talking about what it is they're doing through our LMS. So at a very high level, just going to talk through these few points here. Firstly, it's the access to the content. We've been on a bit of a journey with our online learning at Vanquis over the last couple of years. One of the most important things is making sure that the content that's provided to colleagues around the business is accessible to everybody. Part of that is through the platform that the content sits on, so making sure things like it's mobile friendly, that it's responsive content, and that people can access it on any device they want to. But also that the content is short and sharp and to the point, and people can dip into content without having to consider taking an hour out of the day. So content that's 5 or 10 minutes long is perfect for us to allow people to do it at work during their working day easily, but also that it's easily accessible when they're maybe commuting to work or going home, or even sat on the sofa, scrolling through their phone. Secondly, as Emma's already mentioned, is marketing, and it's really important for us to make sure that all of our colleagues across the business know what content's available. It's a tricky thing to do. We're a big company with lots of employees across different sites. We do a lot of face-to-face discussions with people. The wider L&D team spend a lot of time kind of out with people across the business, talking to them about development areas and the resources that support the different development areas, and of course the Thrive content is part of that. We also use our kind of social media platforms at work. So we use Yammer, Microsoft Teams, our intranet site to promote courses as they're released. And we also link them to different awareness events. So for example, Learning at Work Week or Mental Health Awareness Week, various other kind of national campaigns. We identify content that is relevant to those campaigns and we promote it across the business with all the other activities that happen during the day or the week that those campaigns are running. What's really important to us is peer-to-peer discussions as well. It's great, marketing is really important, and it's great that we have an L&D team that go out to the business and promote content. But it's far more important for us to get our colleagues across the business talking to one another about the courses that they complete and the stuff they engage with online. So the Thrive courses are great for this because they are kind of slightly different, I guess, in style to the more traditional off-the-shelf content that you might expect. And there's also kind of more, particularly working for a bank, there's core subjects that people expect to see all the time. The Thrive catalogue offers a lot more interesting and probably slightly more unorthodox topics for people to learn about. And that's great as a discussion point for people across the business. And finally, what's really important to us is that we create blended programs of learning. So we're working harder and we're doing more and more often, we're creating blended learning programs. So people aren't just coming along to a traditional face-to-face training session in a classroom or a coaching session, but we are building curriculums around a particular subject and including online content, including the Thrive courses in that for either pre-course work, post-course work, or even to do during the classroom training, for instance, itself. So the result has been a huge increase in engagement with our optional learning content through our LMS platform. So these numbers you can see here, the 460% year-on-year increase was the difference between 2018 and 2019. And that was in part due to improving the accessibility of the content through our LMS and how people can access it. But it was also a huge contributing factor was improving the quality of the content that's available to people and promoting stuff that's accessible, quick, and most importantly is engaging and people take real practical learning from.
Yeah, so you've seen the results at Vanquis, you've seen the thought that goes into our content. We understand, the work that kind of sits behind integrating this sort of thing within your business. And we have 120 resources ready to go, a really easy process for getting those integrated into your business and support every step of the way. And for £5,000 per year with no user limits, it's a case of you really can't afford not to. And I think, for us, it's really important that good quality content is affordable. And we're really confident that you can, see some of the benefits that Mike has seen as well. So at the end of this webinar, I will share some details for how to get in touch. But for now, we were going to do a Q&A session. Okay, fab. So we have got a few questions. So I'll start off with this one here, which is quite a good one. This one's for me, I think. So that's about how we actually add to our catalogue and how big we expect it to get, which is an interesting question. I suppose, short term, our target is that for this year, by the end of the year, we'd like to get to 200 resources in our catalogue, which is quite an ambitious target. But ultimately, I suppose, we actually see that kind of tailing off a little bit, and not as a kind of consequence of anything, but as a deliberate choice, because actually for us, what should be a focus is making sure that all of our content, including the 120 resources we've already got, is always up to date and relevant and on top of what's going on in the world. So if you look at something like leadership, for example, rather than just kind of keeping on adding to that, we would like to actually go back and refresh it and revisit it and say, is this still relevant? Is it still modern? Does it still align with what a lot of organisations are doing in terms of leadership? And just think about it in terms of that. So actually, although we'll continue to produce topical content, actually we might find that that rate kind of slows down, so that we don't just end up with this vast catalogue of resources. Okay, brilliant. I'll move on to another question. I think that answers the question. How can we get in here? Q&A, here we go. This one here, Megan, maybe you could answer this one. I have some thoughts as well. Do you use any external companies to verify the language you use is inclusive?
Fully inclusive. So in terms of inclusive, are we thinking of just trying to think what different definitions we might have for inclusive?
Yeah, maybe that's more, is that more like global, like simple perhaps?
Right, okay, yeah. So thinking about it being relevant across people with different levels of English perhaps. So yeah, something that's really, really important to us at Thrive is tone of voice and the way that we write. So our mantra is to always be as simple as possible. Our English that we use is extremely conversational. We try and write everything in as plain English a way as we can. We aim at quite a low reading level. And I think that's something that's a little bit different to maybe other stuff that's out there, is just the kind of conversational tone that we write in. And when we're thinking of an international audience as well, we also think about like avoiding those idioms that might not be understandable to non-native English speakers. So that's like, yeah, I guess that's a way that we appeal to people with different like levels of reading or different levels of English language skills. Yeah.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks, Meg. So another question here is about topical content. So we did touch on this to some extent when we were talking about marketing, but someone's asked a question specifically about like coronavirus and how we respond to things that are going around us. So I guess the key thing to make a point of there is that we are quite proactive in terms of how we approach topical content. So as I said about in my tips for other organisations in terms of using marketing and being inspired by what's going on in the world, we do have like a strategy for that and a kind of scheduled campaign approach, but also in terms of things like coronavirus, where you do have to be a bit more responsive. I guess the question there is to look at what we already have in our catalogue that can be useful there, and also kind of thinking about a sort of novel approach to it. So in terms of what we already have, for example, we've got some really good content in digital skills around things like working collaboratively online, using email effectively, using instant messenger, and those sorts of things can be really handy around this time, because obviously a lot of people are being encouraged to work from home. So it's about thinking what we already have that's useful, but also about what we can add to our catalogue that's going to be useful now and potentially generally always useful to our users. So for example, we've just released something which helps people encourages people to stop the spread of viruses, and we've kind of stepped outside the box a little bit and thought about it in terms of like the things that we might not already be sort of told to do every day in terms of like washing your hands and that sort of thing, which is important, but perhaps there's other angles we can take, and you should see that on our socials today if you're interested. Okay, let's see if we've got a question for Mike, because I'm conscious that Megan and I are talking a lot. Yeah, this is a good one. So Mike, when you were looking for a content provider and you chose us, what was your criteria and how did you go about it?
So I think criteria, I've put aside the kind of financial stuff. I think the criteria for me personally, when I'm looking for any provider of digital content, and when we create digital content in-house ourselves, is that it's to remove as much cheese from it as possible. I think that my experience at least of off-the-shelf content over the years working in L&D has been that it can be quite cringeworthy, not particularly practical, and I find that personally, the cringeworthiness and the cheesiness personally really disengaging. So when we were on the lookout for more off-the-shelf content, different off-the-shelf content, we came across Thrive. I think what appealed to me was that it is kind of funny and it is humorous without being cheesy, but that it's very practical, and it's the type of courses that you can, you spend 10 minutes doing one or two of the courses, but because they're so practical, you can come away with 2 or 3 things that people can take away and put into practice immediately. So I think those are really the 2 key things for me when we kind of engaged with you guys originally.
Brilliant, thanks Mike. This is another one for Megan, I think. We've got a question here about whether all topics are suitable for microlearning, which is a good question. So this specific person has said, I'm thinking topics like EQ, which I guess is emotional intelligence.
Yeah.
So yeah, good question for you, Megan.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And actually, emotional intelligence is something that we're really interested in here at Thrive. And we've been asked a few times if we're going to expand our content offering on emotional intelligence. And the short answer is no. And the reason for that is that we don't think emotional intelligence can be handled in isolation. So for us, emotional intelligence as a topic is something that underpins a lot of our other skills-based content, and it's something that always informs our approach to things like communication and leadership. So I think we won't try and broach a topic around which there's so much useful information already out there, like there is about emotional intelligence. We won't try and do what other content out there is doing. What we will do is use that kind of theory to feed into our approach to other topics that are more easily handled through microlearning. So I think, in short, no, not all topics are suitable for microlearning, but you don't want to use microlearning to teach things that it doesn't fit. I mean, for us, focusing on those core skills is really doable within 10 minutes. Giving people loads of information, there's no point, and anyway, they can go to Google and do that themselves. So yeah, great question. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Meg. Another one for Mike, if you don't mind. So someone's asked what's next for Vanquis. So we've talked about what's happened from 2018 to 2019, but have you got any ideas of things you're going to change or try for this next coming year?
That's a very good question. Obviously, got a new boss, so we'll see. I think for us, it's continuing the journey of mobile learning. We can definitely we can increase our uptake of mobile learning, and really this year to some degree is seeing was the huge increase last year an anomaly because we provided so much new content and much more accessibility for our colleagues. So I think that it's almost kind of seeing what happens next, but continuing to really promote people accessing learning content online. The current circumstances in the country are hopefully going to help us a little bit, as horrible as it sounds, with more people working from home and accessing stuff digitally. But promoting content that is, supports mobile learning is going to be really important to us, and continuing to refine the content that we offer either from off-the-shelf providers or the stuff we create in-house to make it a really accessible, easy thing for people to do wherever they are.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks, Mike.
There was just a little bit of clarification there on what that participant meant about inclusive. So inclusive to ensure that it's correct language used for gender, disabilities and so on. So yeah, absolutely. So something that's really important to us is that we are extremely inclusive and representative of all different kinds of diversity. And that's something that we heavily focus on here at Thrive.
Brilliant, thank you. There's quite a practical question here. So can we get a free trial? Can we see some of the modules for ourselves? Absolutely, yeah, sure. I'll give some details at the end of the webinar, and feel free to get in touch and ask. Like most of our content, we can send you preview links and you can have a look through any particular subjects you're interested in. Just let one of our salespeople know and we're going to provide you with those to evidence some of the stuff that we've talked about today. Okay, maybe just one more question. Do you think that sounds sensible? We're at 25 to, so I don't want to keep people on for too long. Let's have a look. So
got lots of questions.
There's loads of questions, yeah, which is,
do you want to
let's think about something that's slightly different. Okay, this is an interesting one. Any suggestions on getting your organisation to focus more on the strategy or analysis phase? This is coming from a place of having worked for companies who always like to rush this. Yeah, I mean, I guess it's hard to give some general advice. We try to be quite consultative in this sense. So one of the things I haven't mentioned is the kind of service level that goes behind our products as well. So anyone who works with us, we do have like a dedicated sort of account management role, someone who will be able to kind of consult with you on what specifically you're trying to do in your organisation and work with you to like map out some pathways or learner journeys through our content. So it's really hard to talk at a general level about that, because ultimately I guess the message from us is that's really important and you do need to do it, but it needs to be very unique to you. We did do a webinar, actual presentation at LearnTech, which is kind of about this in terms of learning culture. So perhaps if you wanted to get in touch, sorry, I don't have any contact details or anything on here, but the person who asked that question, if you want to get in touch, we could provide you with the slides from that, and then you could see some of the ideas that other people on our team had for how to do that. Okay, brilliant. I think that we're about polished off then. Is that everything? Do we want to ask any more questions? What do you think time-wise? Shall I answer another question? More questions? Yeah, okay. I mean, if people want to log out, they can do so. We've got quite a lot of questions, so I'm being encouraged to maybe just show a few more here. So I'll carry on with some more. Okay, let's have a look.
That looks like it might be an interesting one. How do you suggest that we can engage teams such as those who are in direct services, such as answering queries on phone lines, which may not use Yammer or access online learning due to their restrictions in their role? That's quite an interesting question, isn't it? How do we engage people who've not got the same kind of access to different channels to be reached?
That is a good question. I guess maybe it's about relying on that kind of personalization level. So, you know, in terms of their line manager, thinking about how content can be used to kind of personalize learner journeys. So at the end of the day, like I said, our content is kind of developed so that it is quite discreet and you can kind of build it up and use different units to create personalized journeys. So thinking about that sort of thing. I guess accessibility is a question there. So we've talked before, Michael mentioned about like, you know, all of our content is fully responsive, so you can use it on any device. For example, if you've got a platform like ours, which is quite social, our LXP, then you can just access it from the app on your phone and you can see all of our content on mobiles and the experience isn't reduced. Maybe there's another question there about like, you know, internally how you do that. Perhaps you might have some thoughts on that, Mike? Not to put you on the spot.
Yeah, well, we've got a large call centre, so I guess we face similar challenges with, you know, our contact centre agents are very restricted in their time. They're super busy, so yeah, it's difficult for them, for us to, you know, for them to have time to do stuff other than deal with our customers. They don't always, I mean, they have access to Yammer, but they don't always have the time to spend, you know, looking through Yammer and seeing what's available. So. I mean, it's a difficult thing to answer, and I don't think I've got the kind of silver bullet for it. But I think a couple of things we've done in particular is we work very closely with the management team in our contact centre to let them know what's available, you know, what kind of development areas or challenges they're having in particular at that moment with their team or their department, and just having discussions about them with the content that can help with that. We have created what we call playlists, so they're either role or kind of department specific playlists of content to say they're optional, but it's kind of almost like a curriculum of content to develop your skills in a particular area. So for instance, customer services will have a customer service playlist that includes all different types of content that we give to people. As I've already said, the accessibility around using it on their mobile phones and stuff is really important for us. We've also recently just finished a round of what we call career roadshows. We went around the business. We've done our office in Kent and our office in Bradford so far, where we've invited basically everybody along to find out what's available and just talking to people directly has been really valuable in getting them to engage with not just online learning content, but all the other resources that are available that we offer at Vanquis.
Brilliant, thanks Mike, that's really helpful. And then there's only one question left, so oh no, I'm all right, I'm unmuted. Sorry, we're just panicking that we were muted then. So there's actually only one question left, so I guess I will answer that one. It's quite a simple one. A lot of people use the term microlearning or bite-sized learning interchangeably. Do we see a difference? I guess the answer is no. So based on what we talked about earlier, actually microlearning is just a symptom of how we work. I know that's not necessarily the case for all organisations, but certainly for us, like microlearning is a nice sort of symptom of the way that we work, and the fact that we try and keep our content really focused and streamlined at that sort of top level. So I guess really bite-sized means the same thing. It's just, you're trying to deliver it in chunks that are nicely discrete and as succinct as can be. So no, I don't really see a difference between those in our opinion.
Not in our mind.
Someone's asked a question about how we track learning. I guess at the end of the day, we just kind of adhere to our catalogue adheres to normal standards such as SCORM, and we are looking at future-proofing that in terms of like other technology like XAPI. So I guess really it's ultimately up to the platform in that sense. So some of you mentioned about getting in touch about specific things, for example, to see items from our catalogue, or to any questions you might have about specific items of content, sales inquiries, etc. So please do get in touch using those details. I just wanted to say also a big thank you on behalf of everyone really for Megan and Mike for joining me today, and I hope you enjoyed it. We have recorded everything, so we will be able to provide that to anyone who's tuned in and listened. So thanks again for that. Okay, brilliant.